China insists that it has different interpretations about human rights and rejects the idea that human rights know no boundary. Beijing refused to politicize the issue of human rights. Such debates that involve the model of China and other countries' development have been raging for years. In the meantime, Greece has vetoed a European Union condemnation of China's human rights record at the United Nations. It was the first time the EU has failed to make such a statement at the UN's top rights body. How has China's human rights record changed in the past 60 years? What are China's contributions to worldwide efforts to protect human rights? What else should China learn to improve human rights? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Brian Burdekin, who is a professorial visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and Bert Lockwood, a professor and director at the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray.
As a worldwide recognized leading authority, Professor Brian Burdekin serves as international advisor to national human rights commissions in Asia, Africa, and Central and Eastern Europe. In the past 25 years, he has helped to establish independent commissions in more than 70 countries. Professor Bert Lockwood has devoted his career to international human rights for more than 40 years. He is editor-in-chief of the Human Rights Quarterly and has served on the board of directors of Amnesty International USA.
Welcome to our studio discussion here, gentlemen. Why do you think the Greeks decided to veto a European Union condemnation of China's human rights record at the United Nations?
First, I'd like to say, Ray, it's a great honor to be on your program and to be visiting China again. I have no inside information, but it would seem that given the economic plight that Greece is in, that it's been rather vulnerable, and the significant amount of aid that has recently been given by China would be a factor. When countries evaluate their foreign policy, they take a number of things into consideration, human rights being one, their economic situation another. I think it's fair to say, looking at it from the outside, it certainly seems as if they basically based their not going along with the rest of the European Union because of the recent economic assistance from China.
Are you suggesting clearly that the issue of human rights could be separated from a very practical foreign policy on economic and trade collaboration with a very important partner? And that reminds me, if that's true, that reminds me of what the Bill Clinton administration did. He was able to separate human rights from the discussion on most favored trading nation status, MFN, during his presidency. And therefore, that laid the groundwork for a rapid development in the trade between these two major economies. Do you think this has become a common practice for those underdeveloped countries, or countries that do need to pursue practical policy with China?
Well, I would agree with my colleague. There are always different factors taken into account in any foreign policy decision, and Greece was in a vulnerable situation. It depends, of course, on the relative economic power of the country concerned. Your ability to separate some issues from others sometimes is determined by the extent to which your strategic or security or economic interests are impacted by that. But I think there's one other factor. It didn't really get a very good reception from the other Europeans. But the Greek government said, look, we have a dialogue coming up with China, and we would prefer to make our points to China in the context of a dialogue, not in the context of a public criticism. And I must say, I had the privilege about 40 years ago of advising two of the political leaders in my country. And I think there is certainly a strong argument that in the context of promoting and protecting human rights, that we would all like to do better internationally. Sometimes quiet persuasion, sometimes a genuine dialogue can be as productive or even more productive than an open criticism.
If I could add, Ray, to the one theme to that, there's nothing incompatible with human rights and economic development. And so I think the implicit in the question seemed to be a suggestion that somehow you had to have one or the other. And I just don't see that. I mean, I think one can have both a significant respect for human rights and also have economic development.
First of all, your definition about human rights, because our audience, I'm sure, want to know a clear definition from two distinguished guest speakers, and their knowledge about this issue must be authoritative from your perspective.
Well, the definition of human rights goes back to 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. P.C. Chang of China played a very significant role in the drafting of that. China, in the UN Charter discussions, also pushed for human rights to be included. I think one only needs to look at 1993 and the Vienna Convention of the World, where basically all the world agreed that both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, which are defined both in the Universal Declaration and in the two major covenants, were indivisible and interdependent. And so that I don't think there really is a question in terms of the definition. I mean, there are all sorts of international human rights treaties, you know, the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention's been ratified by every country in the world except my home, the United States. So I don't think there's a problem in terms of knowing what the rights are. The problem is the implementation and the respect for them.
Yeah, execution and implementation matter a lot for a developing country like China, whose economic success has really impressed the world. But Bert, let me go back to what Brian says on the way to persuade China or to bash China on the issue of human rights. Which approach do you think will work in the case of China? Do you think China should be punished, should be criticized openly on the issue of human rights so that remarkable progress could be taking place immediately in this country? Or do you think we would rather turn to a dialogue, very constructive dialogue, which may persist for years?
I'm not sure it's an either or question, frankly. I think it's important for the international human rights community, the international non-governmental organizations to keep their focus on China, to speak out when they see citizens' rights being denied in China. I also think, as Brian suggested, that on the government-to-government basis, that often it's a constructive dialogue that may yield more results. Clearly, one of the things that a number of us have experienced, both in Australia and in the United States, is we have these wonderful Chinese students coming to study with us. And my own feeling is that when people experience freedom in other countries, that and how other countries like Australia and the United States work, that they are going to insist at some point that there be more respect for speech in China.
We are looking at the issue of human rights on the international stage, and therefore a sense of history may help. During the Cold War, the US government was very supportive of some of the dictatorships like Augusto Pinochet of Chile. It supported Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. It supported the Taliban during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And therefore, Joseph Nye, who was the first person to put forward the idea of a soft power, even he himself admitted that there were paradoxical standards in American foreign policy. So on the international stage, don't you think that some of the Western governments have been able to separate human rights values, I mean universal values such as human rights, from its pursuit of a very practical national interest like geopolitical stakes?
There's no question about that. I think that during the 70s and 80s, and in those years I was working as a diplomat, and unfortunately human rights during the Cold War, which you've just referred to, became something of a hostage, for beating each other. And there were countries in the Western world, I think it's fair to say led by the United States, that insisted that civil and political rights were more important than economic and social rights. And as Professor Lockwood just said, it wasn't until we got to 1993, and I was there in Vienna with the Chinese delegation playing a prominent role, that we agreed that all human rights were equal and equally important. And the problem had been, I think, coming back to your point about looking at history, up until that stage it had been two Asian leaders, particularly Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia, who had led an idea about Asian human rights values being different to Western values. Now, frankly, I think in the evolution of our understanding of human rights, that wasn't very helpful. And I think we'd all agree implementation is what is important. But that somehow got lost in a slanging match that went on for 30 years during the Cold War, and I sat through a lot of it, and it really didn't get us anywhere. But now that we have agreed that all human rights are equally important, I think, again, the world has moved on. And without saying that you can separate the issue of human rights from economic or strategic issues, the fact is that some of the countries that were then very powerful, like the United States, in terms of our international situation, are perhaps becoming less powerful for a number of reasons. China is emerging rapidly as one of the most powerful countries in the world. That actually has an impact, I think, on how the debate takes place and whether it is useful or productive just to overtly criticise China, or whether it might be more constructive if we actually had a more mature debate without beating each other over the head. I'll be very honest, when my government years ago started a dialogue with China on human rights, I encouraged my Chinese friends to ask our Australian diplomats, what about all the human rights problems in Australia with Aborigines and treatment of refugees and so on?
You know, one of the worst things that might take place in a dialogue between the West and China would be a blame game. In fact, we don't want to be involved in such a not very constructive dialogue. Having said this, I was invited to moderate a panel discussion about US-China relationship at the Brookings Institution a few years ago to commemorate our bilateral relationship, which was normalized in 1979 during the Carter administration. The very first question I asked was, how could the Chinese Communist Party, the understatement indicated clearly, the party was known for not respecting human rights, was able to navigate the course of our development so successfully? What was the secret or driving force behind the CPC, whose reputation was still questionable for some of the Western observers? Now, tell me why. I'd like to have your thoughts about whether we should pursue a greater variety of models in shaping our development. Human rights must and should be discussed openly, but don't you think it's the approach of having such a dialogue that matters more than the concept itself or understanding of such a concept?
Well, Ray, I come from, I've never been in government. I come from the non-governmental human rights. I've been in the field for 45 years now. If one studies the history of rights, they aren't granted by the government. The history of rights is that it takes struggle, and it takes citizens' sacrifice. You mentioned a number of instances of failures of U.S. foreign policy to respect human rights.
Oh, by the way, we were impressed by I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King, but that's a civil rights movement.
Well, it's a human rights movement.
It's part of human rights.
It's a part of the human. We do, it's called civil rights, but it's part of human rights movement, and those struggles on race still continue to this day, and will be continuing for a number of years. But I mean, like my institute in Cincinnati gave out human rights medals to the three sort of constituencies that represented the Guantanamo prisoners. I mean, one of the greatest stains on our human rights record has been torture and Guantanamo.
Obama, the former president, asked for release of grotesque photos that illustrates the torture and abuse of POWs at Guantanamo. By the way, Guantanamo is part of the Cuban territory. I don't know why it has been taken away during the Cold War, but go on.
No,
please.
It wasn't taken away in the Cold War. It's a history.
Leased.
It was leased for like 99 years, one of these leases, so the lease still goes on. But it's, you know, that has been a real stain on our reputation. The current administration has been de-emphasizing human rights in very recent weeks with respect to Saudi Arabia, for instance, has placed what it perceives to be national security issues higher. So, but I will tell you that from my vantage point, the human rights groups within the United States have been very vocal. Similarly on the climate kind of thing.
You spoke of your president, Donald Trump, who visited Saudi Arabia and sold arms sales, $100 billion worth of a very advanced weaponry. Well, let's put aside this issue. Now, I sent my son to the United States and studied politics and philosophy, history of Western thoughts. He's very proud of 4 years of benefits in the academic circle on the campus. Now, he and other young kids ask me almost the same question as to why there are two amendments in the American Constitution. The first amendment is about the freedom of the media. The second, however, is very, very controversial. It's about the rights of bearing firearms. Now, each year, according to reports of FBI, up to 30,000 people are killed in gun-related violence in the United States, and the rights and life of these poor guys are seriously endangered. They lost their lives. Yeah. Families lost their beloved ones. I mean, this has been very controversial. The first one serves to protect the freedom, and the second deprived the people of their lives. So we are wrestling with the idea, what's wrong with the American Constitution? I remember one cover story of Economist, one prestigious journal that I admire so much. I've been reading this journal for decades. It says, the right of bearing firearms is part of human rights in the United States. It's part of a democracy. This is absolutely difficult for us to accept. I mean,
it's difficult for me to accept. And in fact, our Supreme, if one reads the Second Amendment...
but the United States is supposed to play a role model. I mean, we want to follow a superpower and the soft power, yet in the Second Amendment, this is very debatable,
I think that's the problem. I think there is an assumption, perhaps even in China now, that the United States is a role model. I don't think, with the greatest of respect, the United States has ever been a role model. And I served there for 4 years as a diplomat. I'm not talking second-hand. I mean, I lived in Washington, D.C. for 4 years. What has impressed me most about China is many of the things that are just not done in the United States, whether in terms of the recognition of the necessity for development, raising people out of poverty. But there are so many things in democracy which there's been an assumption that that equates to human rights. You only have to look at the world today. You only have to look across the Atlantic. You only have to look at the United States and perhaps even the United Kingdom to see that democracy has some fundamental problems, not just about the right to bear arms and people being killed, but about the fact that, for instance, in America today, in the last 12 months, more people were killed by drug overdoses than by firearms and automobiles put together. Now, there's something wrong. There's something going badly wrong when there are so many people who are disillusioned or disenchanted or whatever. And so I think to some extent, at least I've been, like my colleague, involved in human rights for over 50 years. And I don't think some of us have ever seen the United States as a model. And I think to the extent that perhaps people in China see that, China has a major contribution.
Majority of the return students actually come back from the United States. They take the United States, the Statue of Liberty, as the role model in examining the implications of human rights. But you are watching dialogue with Brian Burkidin, who is a professorial visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and Bert Lockwood, a professor and the director of the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights. We've been discussing the very serious issue of human rights for a developing country like China, whose very unique model of development has not only impressed the world, but aroused more debates as to why China has walked a different path about human rights. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Now, Jack Ma is a role model. We've been discussing a role model, not only of a country, but of an individual. Martin Luther King is yet another example in your country, across the Pacific Ocean. Jack Ma said in an interview with American media in Davos, the Winter Davos, look, you've waged two devastating regional wars with Afghanistan and Iraq. Trillions of dollars were spent. If you had been able to spend such amount of money on the construction of infrastructure, creating jobs for the losers in the Rust Belt, then Donald Trump would not have won the presidency. Now, that's not what he said. But the understatement suggested that the United States has made a serious mistake simply because you want to transplant democracy through the use of force. I mean, this has triggered serious debates about what should be done with some of the dictatorships or strongman politics in the Middle East since 9/11. So I'd like to have your thoughts about this very meaningful dialogue on the human rights record in the Middle East. Instead of talking about China, which, I mean, served as a powerhouse for the world economic recovery in the worst case scenario, like the 2008 financial crisis. And we are still very dynamic in, stimulating the economic growth. So let's talk about the Middle East and whether next step we can find a peaceful solution to the civil strife in Syria instead of encouraging the rebels fighting the other side. More bloodshed is to come, and more refugees will be left homeless internally and externally, right?
Ray, I wish I had a good answer.
Yes.
The tragedies that are occurring, largely beginning with the United States mistake of intervening in Iraq, not waiting for the United Nations IAEA inspectors for the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, and going in with no plan for what to do after you overthrew the regime, and in terms of development for it. And sort of the series of tragedies we've sort of seen that are going on as we speak. I don't have the solution to that. You talked in terms of had the United States looked inward instead and focused on building our infrastructure. I mean, our infrastructure is terrible. And we've been spending these billions and billions.
It's one of the campaign pledges of President Trump to build American infrastructure, creating more jobs for the poor whites, right?
Well, I think from Australia, we admire you. We can't build 1,000 kilometres of fast trains. You've got 19,000 and about to add another 5 or 6, I think. But just on your point...
But then we come under fire for ruling by decree,
yes,
instead of having endless policy hearings.
Sure.
I mean, that takes years. But 3 generations of the governors in California failed to build a short high-speed railway simply because of the consultation. That takes time. You have to look at each case. It takes time.
And that's my point. I think the starting point in this whole debate has got to be a recognition that every country has human rights problems. I think part of our problem has been that the West has seen itself as in some kind of position to preach to the East or Asia or whatever. And my own experience in this region is that that simply isn't the case. I was taught in law school over 50 years ago that our legal system, the common law, was a wonderful system, one of the best in the world. Democracy, which had evolved with that over 600 or 700 years, not been transplanted in 5 or 10 to Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or whatever. I was taught that it was a wonderful system. When I found myself in law practice, I very quickly found that the poorest, the most vulnerable people in my country could not afford to go to lawyers. They could not afford to wait 2 or 3 years for the courts. And if you looked at our common law, the much vaunted English system, inherited by Australia, inherited by the United States, inherited by Canada, what you found was that it was a system coming out of a mercantile trading empire. If it came to protecting property and contract and commerce, it was fine. If it came to protecting the homeless, the mentally ill, the disabled, or Indigenous people, the common law was a disaster. My conclusion is that some of our assumptions about democracy and the superiority of our own legal system need to be questioned, and we need to be very humble about how good our system is.
Well, that'll be a very interesting debate between Australians or Aussies and the Chinese. Now, that reminded me of what happened to me during my stay in Sydney to cover the 2000 Olympic Games. Cathy Freeman, you know her very well. Cathy Freeman, a role model for athletes in your great country. But she comes from a tribe, or she's an Aboriginal family member. And one controversial case concerning the misery and plight of the Aboriginal people is they refuse to be relocated from underdeveloped area to the urban, a more prosperous urban area. Now, should we respect their rights to live forever in the extremely underdeveloped area, or should we try to persuade them? Look at Brian. He is able to prosper and able to receive very good education in a city like Sydney. But if you continue to live here, you have no chance. We can support financially your education, but you need to first of all be relocated. But they refuse. They say this is the place where we can enjoy the comforts of the cultural roots. We like our lifestyle. We don't have to be changed. Now, this can be applied universally in other parts of the world. You see my point?
I see your point, and you described the exact situation that took place in Botswana a few years ago with the sand. And there was human rights groups that came in to represent the sand. The government wanted to relocate them from this area where they lived and where they were tremendous amount of poverty, and the government wanted to place them so they could get schooling and the like. And that went to the High Court of Botswana, and in a decision by Judge Unity Dow, a majority opinion, they upheld the rights of the San to make their own decisions. And as a human rights lawyer, that would be the side I would come down on in terms of recognizing the freedom of individuals to make that, and not deferring to the government to decide what is best for them.
In fact, the poverty relief campaign in Australia back in the year 2000 involves actually the approach to the poverty alleviation, whether you should force them to leave their homes behind, or you persuade them. So that's somehow the point of our debate as to whether China should be bashed or persuaded to walk its own path.
Well, and if I could just add one thing, because you were suggesting on this thing for the development and the infrastructure, and again, this comes from a human rights point of view. Often what happens when you say you want to cut out that slow process of hearings and deliberations is there's often tremendous amount of environmental damage, displacement of people, real consequences that come to people's lives that don't get covered because the government...
We are coming to terms with the two sides of the same coin, right? You have got to protect the environment. You've got to be concerned as to the proper compensation for those whose houses need to be dismantled to pave the way for building the infrastructure, so on and so forth. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.